I will go straight to my topic, which is the memory politics of the first Saaremaa Biennial, titled Fabrique de Histoire. And the first Saaremaa Biennial, that was both established and curated by the artist couple Peeter Linnap and Eve Kiiler, Linnap at the time, took place in Kuressaare, the capital of Saaremaa Island, Estonia, from July 22 to August 13 in 1995. The main exhibition, titled Fabrique de Histoire, the Factory of History, was divided by two venues, the Kuressaare Castle and the Town Hall Gallery in Kuressaare. In addition to the main exhibition, the show by the students of the Estonian Academy of Arts, titled Artel of History and curated by Marko Laimre, then himself a student, took place at the Kuressaare Art Studio. The biennial was accompanied by a 3-day symposium from July 22 to 25 and by 3-part TV series produced by Estonian National Broadcasting. In terms of the normal biennial show, the main exhibition itself was of a relatively small scale. There were only 26 artists or groups at the main exhibition and 11 participants at the student show. The history of the biennial started a few years earlier. In 1992, Linnap and Kiiler had co-curated an international exhibition at the Saaremaa Photo Festival in Kuressaare titled Images from Borderlands, that also took place at the Saaremaa Museum. And it was followed by the second and the final Saaremaa Biennial titled Invasion in 1997. So there are like 3 topics that I find important concerning the first biennial. First, the artistic practice of the artists turned curators, the exhibition space, and the political context. And if time allows us, I will also mention a few works. The Estonian studies was a term that Peeter Linnap used to sum up his artistic practice at the time, but it also could be used to characterize Eve Kiiler's work and the work of some other artists that used mostly or centrally photography or installations in order to focus on certain themes and subjects. As Peeter later explains in an interview, for Estonians, this period of transition raised the topics of identity, freedom, and self-esteem. Estonia had been taken as the most highly developed region of the former USSR, and the Estonians had been known as the most educated and informed people among the 15 Soviet republics. After breaking down the wall, we discovered quite painfully that, internationally speaking, Estonia's self-image had largely been distorted. It became clear that hardly anybody in the world knows anything about this place and culture. So Linnap was aiming to map the procedure that the Swedish anthropologist Sigrid Rausing, who researched the transformation in Estonia in the early 90s, has described as the movement from the edges of the East to the edges of the West. And according to her, the identity of the people seems to be moving from that of being Westerners in the East to being Easterners in the West. As Victor Misiano mentioned in his opening talk of this conference, the 90s was the time of endless present and of no future, but was utterly obsessed with the question of history, the question of past. So it was quite obvious that the study of Estonia started with the research of the past. And I have here 2 works, first one by Eve Kiiler titled Estonian Home from 1993, where she describes in a very autobiographical manner the history of Estonia, using her family photos and the places where the family used to reside or live, together with this chronological view. Or Peeter Linnap, Kleine Geschichte Estlands from 1996, probably the best work to refer to his concept of Estonian studies, or the emblematic history of Estonia, as he has used the title in English, so which consisted of archival photos of very significant nature, the Song Festival crown, the family photo of our first president, Konstantin Päts, the kind of famous photograph of the Estonian peasants, etc., and of course the drowned ship of Estonia from 1994, pointing towards the constructionist nature of nation. Eve Kiiler stresses above all the importance of the Kuressaare castle context as the Museum of Saaremaa for the conceptualization of the show, stating that since they knew that they were doing the first biennial there, it had to have something to do with the history. Otherwise, the museum would have dominated over the works. This theme allowed us to create a dialogue between the works, mostly medium or small format photo series and the space. So perhaps one could claim that the museum, as one of the central institutions and power tools of the history discipline, the true factory of history, was establishing its narratives, was the true starting point of the show. But nevertheless, I would say that the political context of the of Estonia at the time was the dominant trigger for the show. And Peeter Linnap opens his curatorial statement with the recognition of the use and manipulation of history for political ends. We live in an age characterized by constant bickering over worldviews, tools for comprehension, and viewpoints. We seek confirmation for any variety of viewpoints from history, which has become a warehouse of arguments used by any number of people to support any and all opinions. Fabrique de Histoire was conceptualized and thematized in Estonia, but also for Estonia after the turmoil of political changes in the whole Eastern European region, where history was used as a central tool for political argumentation. Nevertheless, the situation in Estonia was quite exceptional. The historian Marek Tamm starts his conclusion to his article, The Republic of Historians, Historians as Nation Builders in Estonia, late 1980s, early 1990s, with a quote by the writer Tõnu Õnnepalu. In the year 1991, we decisively set out on a road leading into the past. From then on, everything happened under the label of restoration, of restitution. Parishes, schools, monuments, street names, property, money. The new was only allowed to be the old regained. The Republic of Estonia became a truly Proustian project, a journey into the time regained. In his article, Tamm analyzes thoroughly the phenomenon of the decisive role played by the professional historians in the political public events and the organizations of the period, such as Estonian Heritage Society, the Estonian Group of Publication of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as well as the political formation of the ideological constitution of the new independent republic. In 1991, August 20, when the independence was declared, the prime minister was the historian Edgar Savisaar. One of the opposition leaders, soon to become Savisaar's replacement, Mart Laar, was a historian, and a year later the first president-elect, Lennart Meri, was a historian. Numerous historians were in the cabinet of Mart Laar since 1992, as well as in the next parliament. Tamm demonstrates, based on their example, how the historic approach did get intertwined with the political agenda. By the end of the 80s, Estonian society was clearly on its way to regain independence. with the growing conviction that the aim was not to create a new independent state, but to restore the old pre-war Republic of Estonia, based on the idea of legal continuity. In other words, the predominant ideology tended to be one of the legal restoration, worked out by politically minded historians and historically minded political dissidents. In essence, all the political steps taken over the next few years were motivated by a desire to return to a pre-war laws, traditions, and institutions, to rehabilitate and restitute everything that had been destroyed or condemned to oblivion during the Soviet period. It is quite clear that the Soviet agenda appropriated history, denied and/or hid certain traumatic events such as annexation or occupation of Estonia in 1940, the mass deportations in the end of 1940s, and applied and created certain ideologically suitable narratives of history. The national counter-movement, which started to fill the blanks in the historic fabric, as was the popular term at the time, ended up in formulating the historico-political agenda of restoration, of historic justice, and thus, I quote Marek Tamm, making history the influential science of legitimation in transitional Estonia, helping to gain, justify, and preserve power in a new social situation. The engaged historians were not only pursuing the discourse of restoration, but also promoting and revitalizing the popular myths and narratives of the history of the previous republic, the 20s and 30s, and of 19th century, such as the narrative of the Great War of Independence, lasting 700 years, or inserting into the discourse the period, the notion new era of awakening, referring back to the 1860s. History could also serve as a political tool to undermine one's opponent's place in the history. Mart Laar, for example, failed to mention any of his political opponents of the transition period, including the most of the significant figures of the independence movement, such as Edgar Savisaar, leader of the Popular Front, or Arnold Rüütel and Vaino Väljas, leaders of the Communist Party, in his textbook of recent history for the 5th grade in 1999. So, although, according to Tamm, the Republic of Historians started to grumble in 1994 when Laar's government was distrusted and had to resign, this still constituted the social, political, and cultural context where Linnap and Kieler situated and formed the concept for the exhibition Fabrique d'Histoire in the summer of 1995. Despite the fact that it was never indicated directly, one can claim with a certain confidence that the local case of transitional Estonia was lurking behind the larger philosophical questions about the history as a tool of power, or the history in the service of grand schemes, and the history used by certain social structures as a justification of the current status quo, clearly thematized by the curators. Linnap and Kieler emanated from the local experience while conceptualizing the theme, but their interest towards the history was more general, more philosophical and theoretical. The focus lied on the very principles of the political functioning of the discipline of history, as well as memory politics in the society that the biennial aimed to challenge. The question of power of history writing and the place exploitation of image within that discourse was at their focus of interest, as well as artists who challenged the grand narratives of history and the concept of history as a, I quote Peter, as a post-industrial manufacturing process which has division of labor between its units and which has supply, production, marketing, advertising, and other such departments. The curators saw artists as a force who could challenge the discourse of history, who could redefine history by taking distance from it, using irony, analysis, provocation, and rearticulation. And it's also a quote by Peter. According to them, artists make history more sensual personified and changed the points of empathy, but also criticized the truth production mechanism of historic disciplines. Linnap's view on the theory of history, however, was much more limited and not so informed as one would perhaps expect. But since the discourse was absent in the public and professional debates almost fully, his curatorial positioning is remarkable nevertheless. From the author's part of the linguistic turn in the critical theory of history in the 70s, he refers only to Michel Foucault. His quote serves as the motto of his opening essay. His second and not less important theoretical reference point is the analyst historian Mark Bloch's famous Apology of History, or The Craft of the Historian, originally published in 1949 and translated to Estonia already in the Soviet time in 1983. However sparse ain't his field of theoretical references, it is nevertheless clear that he manages to cover most of the relevant critical points of history discipline and historiography. Linnap's interest towards critical theory was very much based in his dive into the theory of photography in the beginning of 90s, which is well reflected also in his opening essay. In fact, if to analyze the references, one can find there three different types of texts. Already mentioned theoretical texts on history, Foucault Bloch, fiction, J.M. Coetzee, Olev Remsu, Herbert Wells, and photography and or art theory, J. Ruby, John Stadthatos, Maria Lind, etc. It is clear that the latter dominates his writing, and there is no doubt that his position here is much stronger than in the theory of history. The second half of Linnap's opening essay is dedicated to the connections of history as a discipline to the visual image, document, monument, art, and the project at hand dividing the works of the show into different categories dealing with documents and monuments, family histories, with the state and private property, and works that challenge the institutions or the cognition of history. He understands the mission of contemporary art as a proto-science and theory to ask questions that science cannot pose due to its conventional limitations. However, artistic work dealing with the questions of history is, according to him, not fully identifiable with the science of history. Art can serve to make history's colors more visible, history's sense discernible, history's sounds audible. He sees scientific cognition as limited, whereas culture turns to thought models which could free science from its spatial temporal prison it has created for itself. He describes the subjective experience of history as physical, fragmentary and non-linear, and opposes individual memory to the histoire totale. On the one hand, Linnap sees the raw material of history, such as documents, artificial or staged, as special case of fiction, whereas artists can make the insignificant history significant and monumentalize the backyards, the anonymous, the miserable, the ordinary. As he puts it, that which earlier seemed of little importance, small, personal, local, becomes important. According to him, history and art meet first and foremost in the forms of monuments and documents, but this is also where they depart. Photography and sculpture are featured at this exhibition not on the basis of formal fashion principle, but rather because the given theme is best expressed in just these forms. In seeking an explanation for this common ground, the concepts of documents and monument come in mind. Both are connected with memory and commemoration as essential building materials of historical science, while sculptures often taken the form of public monuments or cult objects, documents, photos are their private system counterparts. The photographs, objects, and installations on display at the biennial are modulated with just the aforementioned aims in mind. They can be considered private memorial complexes, remembrances, genealogies, and biographies. Monument in this context is not connected with any national memorial principle, the obligatory collective remembrance of the victor, hero, and martyr. It is rather a record of our own experiences. Estonian philosopher Hasso Krull spoke at the symposium of the biennial about the history, or about the Linnap's histoire totale as a binary regime of violence and boredom. On the formal level, however, according to him, there is only one working regime, the script or a chronicle, where history is seen only as a story of performances of preferably violent acts and as a collection of future scripts for such acts, whereas everything else, from its perspective, is harmoniously boring. Based on Walter Benjamin's thesis on the concept of history, on the other hand, Krull hopes that the history of those who didn't win exists. According to Benjamin, this theory of non-winners is disjointed and opposed to the violence, boredom regime that is continuous. This continuous and disjointed history wants to hold fast that image of the past which unexpectedly appears to the historical subject in the moment of danger. For Krull, this constitutes the history of isolated detail and of stopped history movement. According to Benjamin's counter-discourse of history that opens up different kind of historic spaces, the spaces for those who didn't win, Krull also constructs a concept of small photography, the photography of disjointed that is unavoidably fragmented and does not melt into the fabric of history. Perhaps this attitude was characteristic of the dominant part of the works at the exhibition as well, and even those who are not necessarily that are not necessarily photographic. So there were many works that use or reuse archival or accidental or found images, staged, restaged, reworked family photos in order to tell disjointed and fragmentary stories that the histoire totale usually neglects. There are works that play double games with assumed truth claim and the logic of museum display, as for example Mart Villius's work, or the daily newspapers as a reliable source of future histories. There were works trying to regain the human dimension of the historic cognition as a lived experience, or simply creating poetic metaphors, or of its lies and misuse. So, in conclusion, the Saaremaa Biennial was a significant undertaking in many ways and stood at the emergence of many processes in Estonia and Eastern Europe, and this is important also in the world scale. The curators took the biennial format and made an international exhibition together with the conference to research the problematics of history discipline that was still understood locally as a Nationalwissenschaft, with the main aim to regain the truths stolen by the ideologically manipulated Soviet histories, but was totally blind of its own narrative templates and the inner ideological implications. The first Saaremaa Biennial can thus be seen as an attempt to step against that grain with the means of deconstruction of the history discourse in general. The show that emanated from the local context and political circumstances took the problematics of history to a more general level as the questions of theory of history, with a specific focus on the question of image in the discourse of history. And with that statement, I will also end my presentation. Thank you.